gonna get my screen share working. Just like always, I do have the chat up and running. So if you get lost, have a question, I clicked the button. There we go. Just let me know. All right, so first thing we're going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm back over in the FX tab because we're still going to be doing some more simulation visual effects stuff today and on Thursday. So what we're going to do is last class we talked about end particles and end cloth, and then we talked about boss. Today we're going to talk about fluids, and we're also going to talk about what's called bullet. Before we talk about bullet, let's take a look at fluids. So when you click on fluids here, they are what they say. They make things like smoke. You can make things like water, all sorts of different types of fluids, but mostly fluid is things like smoke, explosions, the fun stuff. So when you open this up, you do have create a 3D container or a 2D container. The main difference is the 3D container is in 3D space. The 2D container is in 2D space. The 2D one works really well if you're making 2D shaders or if you're trying to take fluid in here and take it into a gaming engine as a matte 2D tiling texture. So I'm going to go ahead and do a 3D container here. And before we get too far, just know today's homework is the same as last classes. If you do something inside of class today that you really enjoy, take a screenshot, do a render still, do a play blast, and then you can turn that in for today's grade. But you don't have to, like I said, that third thing that I'll at least mention, if you want to play with that and you want to do a render of it, you can most certainly do that as homework as well. All right, so we have our fluid box right here. It is automatically starting with your emitter at the 000 location on your grid. This is really nice. It lets you know that it'll always spawn here, but sometimes we want to move the entire fluid up physically. So I'm just going to move my fluid so it's not in any negative space. It won't hurt it to be in negative space. It is a fluid, like I said. Just be aware that sometimes if you're working on a simulation and you have other objects in your scene, it will start at that 000 point, and you might need to move it to make your scene look a little nicer. Now, when we open up our fluid over here in our outliner, you'll see we also have a fluid emitter. So not only can we move our entire fluid in visible space, we can also move our emitter itself. This will let us, we can keyframe it, we can change where it's positioned. So if we have an object inside of here that we want it to emit from, just a small point, we can move that emitter to where that point is, and etc. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure my fluid is selected. And over here, where our attribute editor is, we have a couple of different things that we can look at. Automatically, our fluid shape should be selected. This is everything that controls your quality and type, as well as everything that will happen with your fluid. Your fluid emitter is just the emitter, similar to how end particles work. Your fluid emitter has basic attributes. There's omni, surface, curve, volume. You can choose when it starts. Is it going to start on every frame? Is it just going to start on the first frame? That sort of thing. And it also has how many rates per second, just like the particles per second, how many fluid stuff is being created per second. Right now it's set to 100. That's pretty all right. In a little bit, we might up that to 10,000 for funsies. You can also change different types of attributes that your fluid has. Do you want it to be a more additive type of density, more additive type of heat, fuel, etc. And there's just some other things in here like volume emitters, emission, and that sort of thing in here that you might need to know about if you're going to be doing something a bit more complex fluid simulation wise. But let's pop back over to the fluid shape. You never, with a fluid, want to scale it here. All you're doing is scaling the fluid box. It doesn't actually scale your emitter, but it will, however, alter how it appears in your scene. So if you do need to make your box bigger, I recommend using this section over here in the side. So I'm just going to make mine 20 by 10 by 20, make it a nice short fat box. Currently, how we have our fluid set up is when we hit play, which you do want to make sure before you start anything, that you have that max real time turned back on. That this is the size you need because this is the amount of space your container will hold. So your fluid right now will not go outside of that box. We also have our base resolution here. It's set to 10. 10 is very low. If I hit play, you see I get this kind of blobby, squarish looking mass here. This is because my resolution is 10. So you can see I have 10 rows by 10 rows, so that this is being spawned inside of that 10. If I restart this and up it to 50 and hit play, there we go. You'll see I now have 50 by 50, and my fluid sim looks a lot more clear, a lot more smoke-like, and less blobby and pixelated. Now, do be aware, those of you at home, that base resolution by size, the higher that base resolution is, the slower and more chunkier your simulation might play back if your computer is a bit slower. Now, if you have a beast like these new Alienwares, you shouldn't have any problems. And like I said, the higher this base resolution goes, so I could take it up to 120. You'll see I get 120 by 120 in here. I now start going a little bit slower, but it's looking a lot more crisp around the edges. Now that being said, you'll see we get this kind of mushroom cloud-esque shape. Actually, I'll take that up a little bit more. This is the actual particle itself moving inside of your fluid, so you can kind of get a visual of how it's moving. We can take a better look at that down here under display with our numeric and boundary draw. We'll take a look at those in a moment with your velocity. But something to be aware of is we do have this boundary X, Y, and Z. This is showing just where the boundary of your actual particle is. So if I'm like, for my boundary Y, I don't want a boundary at the top. It'll still hit it, but it'll no longer, it won't show past that, but it also isn't acting like there's a glass ceiling. So it'll continue simulating as though it is there, but instead of mushrooming out like it's hit something, it goes through it. So underneath content methods, this is how your fluid is building, what it's doing at any given point, based off of things like density, velocity, temperature, and fuel. So your density here is dynamic. You can also do static, which is a bit of a different simulation. So you can see it doesn't move, it's static. And you can also do a gradient. We'll get you too much there. But the dynamic grid will allow you to get a little bit of extra motion in here. I highly recommend leaving your density and velocity at dynamic unless you're doing something very specific. Now this is where you guys can start deviating if you'd like. I'm going to leave my temperature and fuel off, but if you want to create something closer to an explosion, all you have to do is turn your temperature and fuel to this dynamic grid, and that will add some actual digital fuel for an explosion or fire. I'm just going to leave mine off. Next, we have display. So currently, when I hit play, we are displaying as how it would look when it's rendered. You can change that to just density, temperature, which there is none because I have my temperature turned off, fuel, which is the same, collision, I don't have any collision objects in here, density and color, fall off, and etc. I'm going to leave mine as render. Slices per voxel is how dense or how many particles are being simulated for each of these little boxes. Currently my slices are 2, but if I up them to like 4, you can see I get a little bit more happening in here. So it's now creating 4 pixels per voxel, or slices per voxel. We also have our voxel quality. Currently it is set to faster. I'm going to change mine to better. What that does is it kind of smooths over some of the pixels a little bit. Also renders them a bit quicker with better quality. There's also the boundary draw. This is that checker box that I have across the bottom here. It's this plane here. Currently it is set to bottom. You can also do reduce, which only shows you what is not the current view. So it'll show you all the other lines except for the one that you're looking through. We have outline. Why this one exists, nobody knows. But it shows the actual full outline of your entire fluid emitter, which is very heavily tessellated. There is full. Again, I don't know why this one exists, but use it if you like. I think if I hit play, I won't even see my simulation. Yep, it doesn't exist. It's in there somewhere. You can do bounding box. So if you want something that looks a little bit more simplistic, you can have just the outline of your box, or you can have nothing at all. That's all personal preference. Personally, I like to have my bottom draw here for the boundary being shown, or the bounding box itself. But for right now, I'm going to leave it at the bottom. You can choose your own. This one's all personal preference. We also have numeric display. So I can turn that on, and you'll see each particle comes in as a number. This kind of gives you an idea of how many you have at any given point, as well as allows you to pop out and be like, yeah, this 0.013, that one's not in the right spot. I don't like that one as much. You can also do temperature and fuel, but I'm going to turn that off. We also have a wireframe, so you can see your particles as either particles or rectangles. So if I were to go into wireframe and hit play, you'll see them as particles. Some people like them as rectangles. I personally think the rectangles are a little bit more visual. Compared to the particles. Again, that's all personal preference. And then we have our velocity draw. The velocity draw is what I was talking about earlier, when we can see the actual motion of our fluid. So currently, because we haven't changed anything in the turbulence or anything like that, our fluid goes directly up, hits a wall, and mushroom clouds out. If you ever need to see something in your particle or your fluid here to see kind of how it's interacting with the world, you can turn on this velocity draw, and you can see these little arrows slowly grow and change to show you the direction in which your particle is growing, or your fluid is growing, shifting, and moving. This is really nice because if you get some weird motion in here and you don't know what's causing it, you can turn certain attributes off, and this velocity draw will show you kind of the direction in which things are moving. All right, so let's look at some fun stuff. Dynamic simulation. This is everything kind of like how that nucleus was. It's got your gravity, it's got how much viscosity is to your fluid, what the friction is there any dampening to make it go a little slower or heavier. So currently my gravity is set to 9.8. If I make it negative, it will go down. So it would be more like a dry ice instead of a smoke. If I change my viscosity, Upped that just for a little bit. You now see everything goes a little slower, it's a little bit more viscous, sticks together a little bit more. It's a lot slower than it was just a second ago. Same with friction, if I up that, it's gonna take it a second. So it still moves at the same rate, but when it hits other objects, you see it has a little bit more friction to it, just not much. And then if I up the dampening, you'll see it slows to a grinding halt. It's been heavily dampened to make it act a little bit more sludgier, a little slower. The next little area that we have, this is the quality of your particle and fluid in here. So the solver, so the math behind how your fluid works, is currently Navier-Stokes. You should learn about that in one of your math classes at some point. It's one of those crazy big math problems. You don't have to ever do the math. It does it for you. We also have spring mesh in here. As you see, it changes my simulation a bit. So I'm gonna leave that Navier-Stokes. We also have high detail. So if you want it to have more detail to your fluid, currently that is set to off. I recommend leaving that off until you have your basic viscosity and gravity and things like that, as well as your simulation scale and things like that. And then you can change this to either all grids except velocity, which will get you a slightly different simulation. So you can see it, nothing has changed too much here, but this part looks a bit more detailed. Just your velocity. So right through here looks like it's more detailed, whereas the rest still looks a bit pixelated. Or you can do all grids, which will say, hey, make this whole thing look a bit better. Now mine's still going to be pixelated because remember my resolution is a bit lower, but the higher this your resolution goes, the better this detailed solve will go. Other things to keep in mind is there are substeps and quality. So currently my quality is set to 20. If I were to up that nice and high, my solve would definitely look a lot prettier. However, it will slow down my computer a bit, so I'm not going to do that too bad. However, I am going to go up just a little bit to kind of show you. Looks a little bit better by a hair. We can also up our substeps. Keep in mind, anytime you see the word substeps, that just means adding more solvers. It's doing the math a bit more often. Currently, mine's only doing the math once. You can up that, I think, up to 20 or 10. Yeah, 20, which means it'll solve 20 times. Pretty sure if I up mine, I think to 4, it should be okay. Yeah, it's a little bit slow, and you can see it's doing that math 4 different times. You can see my simulation looks a bit different, especially through here. So keep in mind that's something that you can put in here to get more detail and a little bit of a nicer solve. Other fun things, you can change when it starts. So if you like, I need this to start at -200, you can start it at -200. If you're like, no, I need it to start on frame 50, you can start it on frame 50. There's not really an issue right there. However, something fun is this rate scale. This is kind of like a boost to your simulation. So if I change this rate scale just to 5, what it does is says, hey, kind of give a little bit of a kick to my simulation by 5. So even though it's the exact same simulation, I've upped the speed of the entire thing. It kind of boosts it times 5. Now, if I take that back to 1 and click this forward add vacation, this kind of does the same thing. It says, hey, for like 1 second, speed up my thing, but then slow back down. So it's still the same simulation. If I up that again by, let's say 5 again, it goes up by 5 and then slows back down to 1. So how this works is it says, hey, my rate scale is 5, but since I have this forward advocation turned on, it's only doing it for that first 5 like beats. It's not going to keep doing it at that 5. It's going to slow back down to the standard. We also have this little emit in substeps. I recommend only doing this if you plan to render in substeps, or if you're interested in how substeps work. This adds even more and emits them during those substeps. So if you have 5 substeps, it'll emit times 5 each pixel. So just be cautious, that might slow your computer down a bit. We have this enable liquid simulation here. How this will work is it kind of makes it act a little bit more like a liquid, less like a, well, more like a fluid, less like an air or smoke simulation. We have our auto resize here. This is really nice. If you enable this auto resize, it'll make it so it never hits a wall unless you have an actual collision object. So it'll just keep going further and further down for as long as it can. I'm going to toggle mine off, but keep in mind you can keep yours on. You can also add this attraction and repulsion. This adds a little bit more force to your simulation if you were to turn this to density. All it does is it kind of self-propels or pulls in on itself to get you slightly different results. I'll turn that off. Now the fun stuff is this content details. This has all the fun things inside that actually changes how your fluid interacts. So the first section is density. There's a couple ways you can think of this. The density scale is how thick is it overall. Your buoyancy is how floaty or light is it. Your dissipation is how quickly does it disperse. Your diffusion is how quickly does it go through the room. For those two, think about how soon does a smoke tendril disappear versus how a smell goes through a room. So the dissipation is how quickly does your smoke disappear, and your dissipation is if someone brings in a piece of pizza, how quickly is it going to make you hungry. So for instance, if I up my density scale, you can see it gets a lot denser, it's a lot thicker, a lot heavier. And here, if I up my buoyancy, you see it falls a lot quicker. It's a lot more floaty. Where it's going down, it makes it look a lot more heavy. Your dissipation is how long does it live. So you can see I've made it so it doesn't hit the wall near as much. It is pouring rain. Awesome. I did not bring my umbrella. It is in my car, which is down there. Your diffusion is how quickly does it diffuse through an area. So again, think of it kind of like smell. This is a really good one for if you're making candle flames versus candle smoke. I'm going to up my diffusion a bit. Your pressure is how much pressure is behind your force. The threshold is how much is there, give or take, in any amount of points. There's also noise, how much noise is being generated inside of your fluid. The tension is how much is there before it pops or breaks. Since this is a fluid simulation, that tension will act a little bit different. So you can see it has a bit more breakage in here. And then there's also tension and gradient force. These are just different forces that you can act on your fluid to get different things. Then we have your velocity. How quickly does it move in the space, or how does it move in the space? So in here we have swirl. So you can see it kind of swirls in here. How is it moving? Is it more chaotic or smooth? If If I add a bit of noise in there, you'll see it gets a little bit more chaotic on the inside. Turbulence is another thing to kind of add some chaos and motion in here. Just by adding a little bit of turbulence, you'll see we start to get this kind of wave and roll in here where it kind of starts to act a bit more like a waterfall in the wind. You can also up or lower your speed depending on what you need. You can see it goes a lot faster. And then if you've enabled temperature and fuel, this is how your temperature interacts with your fluid. How buoyant does that temperature make it? Is there any extra pressure? Is there any specific turbulence specifically for that temperature? Same with fuel. How much fuel is given at any given point? How quickly is the reaction happening? What's the air to fuel ratio? What's the ignition temperature? So at what point will it ignite? What's the max temperature that you're going to get? How much heat's being released? How much light's being released? So for fun, I'm going to run up here. I'm going to turn those on. Restart my simulation. And I'm going to say my fuel scale is a bit heavier. My ignition temperature is nice and up there. And it's releasing quite a bit of light. So it won't change too much here. But when we go to render, it'll act more like a light. It'll have a bit more fuel to it. And then we have our surface. Now you can, this is all the different things that your cache will read. I wouldn't turn any of those off or on unless you're doing different passes for a render. But next is surface. This is how everything kind of appears across the surface of your render here for your fluid. So you've got a volume render or a surface render. That will change how it interacts. So the surface looks a bit more like a mesh. So for whatever reason, if we were to mesh this, it would look similar to this. So this is a good way to just visualize it. We also have a soft surface or hard surface, but I'm going to go back to volume. Again, there's another output mesh here. Like I said, we'll touch on that in a minute. But now we have our shading and shading quality. This is how our fluid actually appears visually. Not so much how it's interacting with anything, but just how it looks aesthetically. So you can take the transparency down toward the black, which will make it a bit more vibrant, or you can take it closer to the white, which will make it a lot more disappeared. I'm going to leave mine somewhere here in the middle. You can up your glow intensity. This won't really be seen too much until you render. And then there is an edge drop off. So the closer to the edge it gets, the more see-through it will become. Then we have our color. This works similar to the particle. We can click this little arrow here and get our actual color gradient here. So I'm going to do 3 colors. I'm just going to pick a few. Let's do maybe blue, and maybe like a dark purple. Pinkish color. So now you'll see that I get this kind of pinkish purple constant simulation. So it'll always kind of have this like bright glowing pink in the center that slowly goes out to that bright blue. That's because, like I said, my input is constant. If I were to change that to a gradient in any of these different colors, I'll get a slightly different simulation look. You can also do like a center gradient. You can go based off of density. So the more dense any part of your fluid is, the more closer to the pink it will become. So I can see my density is here. Since I have my temperature and fuel on, the hotter the part is, the more towards that purple it will become. So this part is hot, right here is hot. Same with fuel, the more there is fuel. So it starts right there, slowly goes down. You can see there's more kind of staying alive through my simulation. And then there's pressure. So the more pressure a spot has, the closer to the purple it will be. And then you can start doing combinations like density and fuel, that sort of thing. So I'm going to go up to X gradient. And I'm going to just turn all of these off. I'm going to leave it at this dark blue. Then we have our incandescence. This is how is it glowing? How is it going to appear to be glowing? I think if I hit render right now, it should show up as something. Yeah. So you can see I have this incandescence because I've added fuel. It'll automatically start glowing. When you don't have fuel and temperature on, this incandescence is there, but it comes in as only black. Sometimes it'll just come in as off, that sort of thing. Unless they've changed that for the newest update, this shouldn't come in as anything unless you have those turned on. Now, I can automatically come in here and be like, hey, I want to change these. Maybe I want to make it glow more blue instead of the yellow and orange. I'm just going to come out here. Which will get me a slightly different glowy appearance. So this is really cool. So you can either make explosions, you can make magical smoke that kind of glows and swirls around your characters. All sorts of really fun stuff in here with Fluid. Oh, thank you. All right. Other things you can look at is we have an opacity here. So you can click inside of here and add more or less points. The more points you have, the more art you can get your curve in here. So if I want to change how certain parts of the simulation looks, I can just change the opacity scale inside of here, and you can see I get a slightly different visual based off opacity. Now it looks almost like water coming out of a drain. It's kind of gloopy. Compared to this one, which is a lot bigger, more like a waterfall. So definitely play around with your opacity in here. The other thing you want to look at is your shading quality. How much quality do you need? It's automatically set to 1, but you can up that as needed. And there are other different types of methods that you can use in here. You can change if there's a texture. And then you can also make sure that it's got some shadowing in here. So do you want it to have more shadow or more dynamic shadow, that sort of thing. And then what color do you want those shadows to be? So currently I turned on self shadow. So you can see over on this side right here, it's a bit darker because it's shadowing itself from where it thinks the light source is. So if I turn that off, disappears, turn it on. This adds a bit more realism to your fluid. So if you are creating something like an explosion, or if you're making some smoke, having that on will make it seem more realistic. Anyone have any questions about fluid or anything like that? so let's do something fun with it. I'm going to delete this fluid. I'm going to completely get rid of it. And I'm going to make a sphere. Now what I'm going to do with this sphere is I'm going to keyframe it so it goes up and then bounces back down to the ground. So I'm going to make sure it's above my 0 point. I'm on the first frame. I'm going to keyframe. Maybe at about frame 30, I want it to come up here and hit S. And then back on frame 60, I'm going to bring it right back down to the ground. So it looks like this. I'm then going to go into my graph editor here, and I'm just going to change some tangents to make it look like it's a bit more bouncy. So like it's hitting a shape. Boing. Maybe the opposite direction. Maybe it looks like it's hitting this way. Yeah. So now it looks like it's hitting a shape. I'm going to turn my grid off. And then I'm going to go back to this effects tab. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a fluid that will drive a particle simulation to make it act, to make that particle system act like a fluid. It looks really neat, and the more particles and rates that you throw on these will make it look a little bit more interesting. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make sure my object is selected, and when I come up here to fluids, I can go to this add edit contents, and I can actually emit from an object. So anytime you're working with something and you want it to be your emitter for your fluid, you can do that. You just have to click emit from object. It'll tell you there's no fluid here. That's fine. We just have to make a new 3D container. Delete your old fluid emitter. Click on your surface or your fluid, then your object, and then come up here and emit from object. And what should happen is inside of your sphere or object, you should get that new emitter. So when you hit play, you can see it tries to follow that object, but we haven't changed too much about it yet. So it really doesn't do much. So what we're going to do is inside of this fluid, I'm going to go ahead and change my base resolution to something higher. I'm going to say 75. Keep in mind your computer speed. The higher that number goes, the slower your computer goes. I'm going to make sure my density and velocity is still dynamic grid. And then I'm going to go down to my dynamic simulation, and I'm going to make my gravity negative. You can leave yours positive. Remember, all of these numbers that I'm putting in here, you can do something slightly different if you like. You don't have to follow mine exactly. I'm also going to change my rate scale to 5 again. And I'm going to turn that forward advocation on. And then I'm going to make sure that my auto resize is on. So when I hit play, I get something that looks like that. So I'm then going to go into my contents here, and under density, I'm going to make sure my dissipation is nice and high because I don't want it to last for forever. So even that almost feels too long. So I'm going to up that a bit more. Maybe even higher. That's about right. Now keep in mind you can keyframe this as well. I'm going to lower my density scale as well, make it look a little bit thinner. remove some buoyancy, make it go a little less up. You can also take this to 0. And it'll stay right on your shape. I just want to ever so slightly following, get a little bit of that fluid look. Be a bit more. I'm also going to add in a little bit of swirl and noise in my velocity and just a hair of turbulence. Remember, you can make this look however you like. I just want a little bit more natural motion to it. And then I'm going to come down to my shading, and I'm just going to put some nice colors on it. I'm going to go from blue to white, a gradient. And that's just for my visibility so that you guys can see it a little bit better as well. Now, I am going to add a plane in here. And I'm going to have our fluid collide with this plane. So inside of fluids, fluids doesn't work like any of the end particles or end cloth or constraints or anything like that. It has its own colliding system. So when you want to have something collide with your fluid, all you have to do is come into this fluid section and come down in here and hit make collide. Oh, and you want to make sure you select your fluid, then your shape, and then hit make collide. So now the fluid itself interacts with the ground, even though our ball doesn't, and that's okay. Now, since we're going to be having this advocate from a particle system, which looks really neat, and it sounds really complicated, it's really not that bad. What we need to do is come up here to end particles, and we want to make sure we're creating an emitter that isn't the legacy one. We want to make sure it's the new one. And when you create it, you don't want to touch it at all. You just want to leave it exactly where it is, because what will happen if you move it or scale it at all is it'll mess up the simulation we're trying to go for. So now that we have a particle system in here, we have our fluid system in here, we've got our animated object in here, what we're going to do is come up here to Windows, go to our relationship editor, and click Dynamic Relationship. What Dynamic Relationship does, it says, hey, I want certain things to attach to certain things. I want them to have a movable relationship. And it'll bring you to this little window right here. All you need to do is click your end particle, and it'll bring up everything your end particle can attach to, which is currently the end particle shape that it is, and your fluid shape. So all you have to do is just click that little fluid shape, and then close the window, and it'll automatically assume that it is attached to your fluid. So if I hit play, nothing really changes too much. I'm going to hide my fluid. You can see my particle is down here trying its hardest to follow that fluid sim. It's trying so hard. It's waving its little tiny bits. It's trying to do the thing, but it can't. So the other day when I mentioned that in here, you have that conserve, and how sometimes that conserve will change how a simulation moves. If we take that conserve all the way down to 0 and hit play now, why are you not doing the thing? It should have done the thing. Unless they've changed how this interacts, which would be upsetting. Bear with me, guys. There we go. So it's not acting exactly how it's supposed to for some reason. I'm gonna have to look into this a little bit more. I think they've changed how it works. But you can kind of see what it's trying to do. It's trying to follow that motion. And get a really interesting simulation that follows that motion instead of it following a normal path line. Questions about that? I know it didn't work exactly how I was trying to get it to work. But any questions just in general about how that fluid particle advocation kind of works? No. I know it's early. Well, I'm going to go ahead and delete this sphere. I'm going to put my fluid emitter back inside my fluid and re-show that. I'm going to delete that M particle and the sphere. Delete that fluid altogether. Just make another quick one. Same thing. Gonna throw some numbers in here. Turn my auto resize on. Advocation. Get something that looks a bit like this. There's some turbulence on it. A little bit of velocity. Too much turbulence. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to convert this mesh to a, or this fluid to a mesh, similar to how we did the particles. So I'm going to make sure my fluid itself is selected. I'm going to come over here to modify and then convert. And you can do fluid to polygons. I'm going to click that. Just like before, it automatically changes to a mesh. You do have to come over here to this output mesh section. This one works very similar to the other one. However, you don't have to worry about trying to get certain things to pop up. However, you do have this triangle, quad, tetrahedra, or acute tetrahedra mesh. I just broke it. You do want to try to leave it as triangles. That'll be the most smooth. As you see, I changed it to tetrahedra and broke it. There we go. So I'm going to leave it at triangles. Your resolution is how much smoothing and how many triangles are there per space. So if I pop in here, up that, you'll see I get more triangles. The less there is, the less detail there is. And the more smoothing iterations you have, the smoother it will become, so it will add more mesh data. So that's pretty neat. Yeah. So I'm going to delete both of those, and we're going to do something a bit different. So I'm going to turn my grid on, and we're going to work in what's called Bullet. Now, Bullet is a really cool simulation for destruction and physics. However, if you notice, I am in the effects tab, but there's nothing up here that says Bullet. That's because we have to enable it in our settings and preferences and plugin manager. So for this part, make sure you do have this open. And all you have to do to make sure it turns on is you see this ABC bullet right here. You want to load that, and then there's a bullet section down here, and you want to load that. So it's like the first and then almost the last, right when you open up your plugin manager. And then all you have to do is hit close, and you'll see we have bullet here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a cube. And then I'm going to create another cube, another cube, another cube, another cube. And I'm going to take all those cubes, I'm going to duplicate those, and then duplicate those, duplicate those, duplicate those. And then I'm going to take all of those, duplicate those, duplicate those. So that I have this nice little pile of boxes. Now, how Bullet works is it uses physics. So this is another reason why you have to take physics to simulate how these things will fall and interact with each other in that sort of space in real time and with real physics. So I'm going to highlight all of these, and then I'm going to come up here to Bullet, and I'm going to make them active rigid bodies. What the active rigid body compared to passive rigid body means is, hey, these are going to be moving, they're going to be interacting with each other, versus the static rigid bodies, or the passive rigid, which means, hey, they still interact with stuff, they're just not moving first. So when I hit play, you do want to make sure, by the way, with Bullet, that whenever you're adding an active or passive rigid body, you are on frame 1. If you're on frame 20 or frame 30, you might get some weirder results because that's when it'll think you want your stuff to start. So I'm on frame 1, and I'm just going to hit play. And they fall through the ground, just like when we do end clock. And if you come over here to your outliner, you'll see that it created this bullet solver here. Pretty much what this is just like the nucleus, just like with the fluid section that has about the gravity. This is where all of your collision and things like that are. So inside of here, you've got your bullet solver and your bullet solver shape. If we open up all of this stuff, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different things in here that we can look at. Our solver properties are when are we starting the simulation? Is there any different acceleration? That sort of thing. Do you want to use Maya fields, which will give you a slightly different simulation? It won't do anything. We have our gravity here, our wind direction. We have our solver display. We have our collision filters, our object display. And then we also want to make sure we have this ground plane turned on. What that does is says, hey, remember what I said about starting in the middle? Gave me something weird there. Turn that back up. You see, when you hit play, they will collapse, act upon each other with physics, and act dynamically. So that's cool, right? It's neat. So what we can do now is I'm going to go back to frame 1. I'm going to create a sphere and make it nice and big. And I'm going to make this sphere a passive rigid body. Now, obviously, what immediately happens is it also acts as a collision because we're not moving it. But it automatically builds with this green box around it. This is its collision. This is a sphere, not a box, right? I think I know my shapes. We have to manually tell the collider type to change from box to sphere. Anytime you're working with a mesh as a collider, you will have to change how it is interacting with this collision here. If you have a box, it would be a box, sphere, capsule, hull, mesh, plane, cylinder. If you have a mesh that needs to move that isn't listed here, hull works really good. It just uses that mesh data. Similar to mesh, this is static only. Hull will give you something that will be movable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play, and now that it's that static collider, boop, it interacts naturally. That's cool. So I'm going to hide all these. And I'm going to make another sphere. I'm going to lift this back over here a little bit. But I'm also going to make a couple of cylinders that are nice and tall. And I'm going to duplicate those in kind of a bowling pin pattern. It's not precise, but it's close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make our bowling pins here passive colliders or passive rigid bodies. Again, it's like, hey, these are obviously cylinders. They're not boxes. Now you do have to manually change each one of these on their own. So if I click on this one, I'll have to come over here to bullet rigid body, change it to cylinder. This one I'll have to change to cylinder. It's a bit tedious if you have lots of objects, since you can't change them all at the same time unless they fix that, and I just don't know. And when we hit play, they don't do anything because they're static bodies. Now I'm going to take my sphere here, and I'm going to create it as an active rigid body. I'm going to make sure that its collider type is sphere. And then in my bullet solver, I'm going to make sure that ground plane is still on. And when I hit play, it doesn't really do anything. It just kind of falls, maybe rolls a little bit. But we can change how it's moving. So currently, I have changed the interface here. I see what I did. I'm going to back up a bit, and I'm going to make this sphere a passive rigid body. There we go. That'll do it. And I'm going to make sure that collider shape, again, is sphere. It's not gonna do anything. And then I'm also going to take my cylinders here. I'm gonna delete those. I'm gonna rebuild them really quick. I got these back messed up. They are backwards. Ooh, wrong way. I'm gonna make my bowling pins again. Close enough. And when I select those, instead of doing the passive, these are the active rigid bodies. Again, I have to change all of them to cylinder. Oop, not auto compound, cylinder. So they're a little bit in the ground, I think. Lift them up a bit. Do just 3, since I keep having apparent problems. Select active rigid body, cylinder, cylinder, cylinder. Why are you bouncing so much?
It's probably the hidden sphere.
Ah, yes, I think you're right. There we go. Thank you. All right, so what we have to do now, so I'm going to click on my sphere here, come into my rigid body shape, and currently my body type is a static body. So even though we have it as a static colliding object, so this passive rigid body, we can actually change that to both kinematic and dynamic. The differences between the two is kinematic is keyframeable to get motion and propulsion, whereas dynamic is still keyframeable, but it's constant. So I'm going to change this to dynamic. And then down here, we have initial conditions. This is its initial location. Then we have, ooh, wrong button. We have forces and impulses, collider properties, and the filters. We also have a dynamic system where you can add in some code and all sorts of other stuff. So with its initial conditions, I'm going to change its velocity in the z space to -25. So what will happen is it'll shoot off in a different direction. Whee. So I have to change that. So let's do -25 for me in the x. Whee! Oh, look, they collided. So how this works is currently the mass of these pins are set to probably really low. So if I click on my cylinder and come in here, you can see my mass is 1. If I change that to like 10, It now doesn't move near as much because it's heavier. My ball would need to be heavier for it to interact. Now the impulse is how much impulse is it being drawn in a certain direction. So if I'm like, hey, I want it to be impulse to bounce like 10 in the Y direction. Oops, wrong object. This object. So it shoots off like really far. So I can change it to 1. You'll see it bounces and then goes straight up because it's being pulled based on impulse in that direction. So that's pretty neat, right? Does anyone have any questions about Bullet? It's pretty cool. You get all sorts of really interesting simulations in here. Questions? Okay. I know it's early, everyone's asleep. Well, that's all I wanted to kind of go over with you guys in class today. The last thing on the list that I do want to talk about is you do have the option, homework-wise, if you didn't want to do something with the fluid or you didn't want to do something with Bullet. On D2L, there is a few tutorials about how to do hair inside of Maya here. If it's changed a little bit, please let me know. It should be the exact same. But hair is really neat inside of here. You can get it to animate. You can get it to be styled how you want. You can use it for fur. All sorts of really neat stuff. But that's something that if you guys are interested in, you can do that either right now during class time, or you can just opt to not do it. That's also perfectly fine. Any questions? Okay. Like I said, that's all I have. The homework is just like last class, do something, have it rendered, play blasted, and turned in by next class on Thursday. And then on Thursday, we'll start project 4. And if you want, y'all can head on out. I'll see y'all later. Those of you that want to stick around or have any questions, please do. But that's all I have.